Our lunch presentation is Cybersecurity and Energy, and our speaker is David Hickton, who is the founding director of Pitt's Institute for Cyber Law, Policy, and Security. I first met Dave in the first day of law school in 1978. And at that time, I would not have really foreseen that I'd be getting to introduce him to speak in front of this group. Didn't really foresee that either one of us would ever be employed. So we've done better than expectations. David was served most recently as the United States Attorney for the Western District of Pennsylvania. He served in that position from 2010 until 2016. Prior to becoming the U.S. Attorney, Dave was engaged in private practice of law in the areas of transportation, litigation, commercial, and white-collar crime. And we're probably going to get to look at your schedules. We're probably going to go about a half hour with David, and then we'll proceed to the next panel. All right? David Hickton.
Thank you, Kevin, for that warm and generous introduction and for this opportunity to be with all of you today. I'm a shameless fan of Kevin Abbott. He was the smartest person in our small group section in law school, and he's engaging in false modesty when he talks about exceeding his expectations. But one thing about Kevin is when I first met him, he arrived at law school in a blue Pittsburgh Penguin jersey. He's an ardent hockey fan, and the Penguin jersey that's blue has had a revival. But as you can tell from the scheduling, and those of you who, like me, struggled with parking, Kevin knows nothing about basketball. I also want to acknowledge our other law school classmate here, Byron King, who's a great friend and was also in the class of '81 at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law, which is the greatest graduating class at Pitt Law School. As Kevin mentioned, I served as United States Attorney from 2010 to 2016, and you may not have paid as focused attention on the work that we did there, but one of our signature priorities was cyber law enforcement. The backstory on that was when I began, I sat down with John Surma, who is head of U.S. Steel, and Leo Gerard, who is head of the United Steelworkers, and asked them to help me mentor young kids to keep them out of a life of crime. And they quickly agreed, but then they introduced to me the concept of intellectual property theft and cyber espionage, which was really causing a drip, drip, drip drain on our energy and innovation in this country. And copycat products in every market sector were appearing in the largest market in the world, which is the American market, largely produced by state-sponsored companies and being sold below cost. So we here were doing the innovation. The innovation was being stolen through cyber, and copycat products were being brought in to rob us of our expected bounty and harvest from that innovation, and we were losing market share and job loss, and plant closings, especially here in Western Pennsylvania, were the state of play. So we created a national security cyber group, and we set about, it didn't happen by accident, to identify nation-state hackers who were taking from American companies. And within 4 years, we indicted the People's Liberation Army of China for stealing from U.S. Steel, Westinghouse, ATI, the United Steelworkers of America, and we had other companies as well. 2 weeks later, we indicted Yevgeny Bogachev, who was the most notorious Russian hacker in the world, who had a reprise after the sanctions for the 2016 election hack. The wanted poster of our prosecution here was used. You probably saw it on TV and didn't know what it was. And we did 2 other cases that are in everybody's list of the top 5 enforcement cases: the dark code cybercrime market and the Avalanche conspiracy, which was basically the platform for spear phishing around the world. So if anyone rated the top 5 cyber law enforcement actions taken, they happened here in Pittsburgh, 4 of them, and we did other cases as well. So that kind of took off real quickly, and it's become a trailing legacy for our time in the Department of Justice. Now, I'm no longer there, but I would predict for all of you that Pittsburgh is going to continue to be a mecca for cyber law enforcement, and it's going to become an important resource to you as we talk about some of the threats and maybe the opportunities in the energy sector. Where I am today now is we have a new institute at the University of Pittsburgh that's called the Institute for Cyber Law Policy and Security. I want to introduce you our Executive Director, Beth Schwenke, who's here, and our Technical Director, Ray Winstead. And our goal, quite simply, is to try and identify the big digital questions and see if we can provide answers, and maybe go upstream further, and maybe we can actually frame the questions. So we welcome this opportunity to work with all of you. I'm eager to give you my best guess on what the threats and opportunities are in your space today in the next 20 minutes. But I hope this is part of a continuing conversation and that we can continue to work with you. Our institute is the brainchild of Pat Gallagher, our chancellor, and if you don't know, before he was chancellor at Pitt, Pat was the director of NIST and deputy director of the Department of Commerce. So the NIST framework, which you're familiar with, which governs your industry, was developed under the leadership of Pitt Chancellor Pat Gallagher. And later, Pat Gallagher was one of the 12 people selected by President Obama to do the look forward on the critical issues in cyber, and it was the Cyber Commission which became the platform for the baton handoff between the Obama and Trump administrations in cyberspace. So you think of 12 people in the country who aren't working in the government, who are anointed by the President of the United States to look at these questions, and one of them was Pitt Chancellor Pat Gallagher. So he is a cyber rock star. Pat's executive assistant in both jobs is a woman named Kirsten Todd, who is our institute's resident scholar in Washington, D.C. So we have a relatively small institute. It's interdisciplinary. We have affiliate scholars throughout the various colleges at the university, but in Pat and Kirsten, we have the 2 leading policymakers in the country on cyber, and arguably in me, the front chair pilot in the cockpit with respect to cyber law enforcement. So if you have issues that you think we can be helpful on, I want to encourage you to reach out to us. And I think if you follow us on Twitter or you look at our website, which is cyber@pitt.edu, you can keep up with our work. One final thing. Our work generally falls into 2 buckets. It's programs and it's projects. So we had a program on Russian hacking last February where you can still watch it on our website. It was deemed to be a very positive and well-received program. We brought Andrei Soltatev in. Andrei Soltatev is one of the leading dissidents in Russia to talk about, at that time, 3 names that you've never heard of: Paul Manafort, Roger Stone, and Carter Page. And now they're in the lexicon for all of us. We ran a camp in conjunction with the Air Force Association last year for kids. It was the largest camp of its kind, and it's run in conjunction with the Cyber Patriot program for youth education. One of the big things we're focused on is youth education and workforce development, which I know is a challenge for all of you. And recently had David Sanger here, who's a 3-time Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times reporter, talking about the challenges we face in cyberspace, and you can read about that. So we're about to launch a Salon series in partnership with CMU, which begins April 11th. We have an election project we're about to announce that's being funded by the Heinz Endowments that I think is going to be very exciting. And by any measure, given Pat Gallagher and Kirsten's work and our close association with not only Kevin but Greg and all the work here, working to protect the grid is certainly going to be a key component of our work. So we look forward to working with you going forward. I think in understanding the energy sector threat stream, the best thing I can tell you is when I was United States Attorney, I had sleepless nights every day about worrying about the energy grid. I know those of you in this room paid more attention to it on a granular level than I did, but if you were just watching the news, you would see that we would have these periodic brownouts or blackouts, and we were concerned that there was an attack that might be something short of a full-scale attack, but might be a probing attack to test our response. And that's what I used to worry about as U.S. Attorney, because I had this wide portfolio, and if you ever become U.S. Attorney, when you turn in your phone, you're giving back the phone that you associate with perhaps the best job a lawyer can ever have, but you feel this tremendous sense of relief because there is simply no way you can shed the responsibility that if something bad happens while you are on that watch, it is going to become your responsibility and you own it. And what I was really worried about was a combined attack every day on our energy grid, which would disable our ability to respond, and then perhaps a parallel ground attack that might be a terror attack. And when I saw that suburban Washington malls lost their power for a period of 20 minutes, that would just shake me, because I instinctively understood that we were at risk, we were not prepared, and we needed to get prepared quickly. I don't need to tell you that the energy sector is a primary, not a secondary target for cyber attacks. This is true not only in the United States, but it is true around the world. General Keith Alexander, who used to run NSA and who was on that 12-person Obama Cyber Commission with Pat Gallagher, has been quoted as saying that 41% of cyber attacks are targeting the enterprises of energy, and particularly oil and gas. And these attacks, while they are very significant, and this is a recurrent theme of my message to you today, are really crude cyber attacks. They're phishing, they're viruses, they're spying on you through spyware, and they are Trojan horses. I think that the best way to look at the threat would be to look at the Department of Energy's Quadrennial Energy Review, which basically says in the current environment, the U.S. energy grid faces imminent danger from cyber attacks unless we engage in a discrete set of actions which give us clear authorities to inform both our responses and deal with the threats. A widespread disruption of electric service in this country that was initiated by a cyber attack could undermine United States lifeline networks, our critical infrastructure, much of the economy, and cause danger to the health and safety of our citizens. There is no way to overstate this risk, and you are all on the front lines of this. What is of particular concern to me is that we have 3,300 facilities in this country responsible for generation, transmission, and distribution of electricity, and that they are all interconnected. As a result, a disruption at one utility could cascade into a catastrophic attack for the entire country. This is an unprecedented exposure, and it is my humble opinion that we are more exposed than we ever have been in the past because we continue to increase interconnectivity for ease of access and for our use. It's folly to think otherwise, that nation states know this, that the malicious actors we face are aware of our vulnerability in this space. And it is also simply true that we are falling short in taking the decisive action that we need to take to deal with this. I think the best way to illustrate this is look back. And the most significant example is the Stuxnet attack on the Iranian reactors. Now, I'll tell you a funny story. For a long time, I was not allowed to talk about this. This was under the code name Olympic Games, and there was a Department of Justice investigation into the reporter David Sanger, who was just here, and General Cartwright, known as Hoss Cartwright, who ultimately pled guilty to lying to the FBI about whether he leaked information about Stuxnet, and then was pardoned by President Obama for his crime. But the Stuxnet attack was basically an attack on a SCADA system that's not dissimilar to the SCADA systems we have here. It was a zero-day attack, and it was discovered kind of innocently by a recycled reboot loop that was happening within the system, or it might not have been discovered for some time. But you know the story because it's now the subject of vast public comment, and it's been chronicled in a movie, and the very controversial Edward Snowden disclosures, which talk about metadata at level 2, Snowden went forward and said that the attack was done jointly by the United States and Israel. Now, one thing that I'll park to the side about all of this, and you can say the same thing about drones, is that when you're in the vanguard of change and you're moving the needle with respect to how we use technology or what initiatives we take to protect us, one of the things that rings around in your head is, what am I unleashing here? We've been very successful at protecting ourselves with a very aggressive program of using drones around the world. And who among us has not seen the image of a very notorious terrorist vaporized in a car when we've dropped a drone on him? And we are safer because of that, but what we have not confronted is what is going to be our legal framework for those authorities, and we have not confronted is what are we going to do when the drones can be used against us. The same is true when you talk about Stuxnet. The Iranian nuclear program is something that threatens us, and it's in the news today under another iteration. But it's fairly clear that in 2010, we basically spun their system to a point of overheating and rendered it useless. And so the question becomes, could that be done to you? So among the laundry list of things that used to keep me up at night from 2010 to 2016 would be what would happen and what would I do if a factory here in western Pennsylvania was spun out of control to the point that it exploded. What would be our response? What are the legal authorities? What are the rules? And how could we do things to protect you? So what I did when I was U.S. Attorney was try to increase the outreach. We had a program through the FBI called InfraGard. I expanded it. The concept of Moore's Law, which you all know, has been turned on its head repeatedly in this space because the speed and dynamic change that we're experiencing is so rapid that during the course of 6 years as U.S. Attorney, I used to watch IT directors get fired when they went up to the C-suite to say that we've been hacked, to the Target and Sony cases where the CEO got fired. And by the time I left as U.S. Attorney, I was talking to boards because they were worried about being sued. So at least now we all own the problem. But the question when you look at Stuxnet is not, did we protect ourselves from an Iranian disaster that might be initiated by a nuclear attack on Israel, but what does this mean in terms of the cyber norms going forward? In 2012, in an attack that Leon Panetta at the time said was the largest and most devastating attack on a company, the Saudi Aramco facility was hit with the Shamoon virus. And this was done by the Swords of Justice group that we pretty much know was associated with Iran. I think for your purposes, you need to know that there are 4 countries we worry about all the time: China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. They are our nation-state cyber adversaries. But this virus was really triggered by a scam email that was clicked onto by an employee, just like one of your employees. You know, this question we're dealing with at some point can be reduced down to the question of, is it a technical issue or is it a human behavior issue? And I go back and forth. People tell me that the most perfectly trained workforce will still have 1 out of 7 clicking on a malicious attachment. I can make cybersecurity as simple or as complicated as you want, but in the most simple side of the axis, it's changing passwords religiously with dual-factor authentication. It's disaggregation of your data, and it's enforcing that people get fired if they click on an attachment, any attachment, without first calling the sender. If you did those 3 things and those 3 things only, you can make yourself safer tomorrow. But ultimately, as I'll explain at the end, what you need to do in your own company is tailored towards you. But who among us would not click on an email from the CEO, which was how the case against China began? John Surma allegedly sent an email to all the employees February 8th, 2010, attached, please find latest steel industry trends. Now, who among you, if you worked at U.S. Steel, wouldn't click on that? And who among you would call John Surma, the CEO? And which CEO wants to receive all those phone calls? But it was a spoofed email. He didn't send it, and it opened up the U.S. Steel system like a can opener. And that's what we're talking about. So it's a serious attack by basically a simple method. In 2014, there was, as part of a series of North Korean attacks against South Korea, a cyber attack against their nuclear plants. Now, I didn't realize when I became U.S. Attorney, despite the fact I grew up here and lived here, what a source of nuclear power we are here in Western Pennsylvania. And our partners at Southern have rescued Westinghouse in Georgia, but between Bettis and Westinghouse, we have 3/4 of basically the nuclear power capability in the country here. And the nuclear power plants were at issue in the China hacking. And so how many Bhopals do we want to have if companies or individuals are trying to reverse engineer off a hacked plans for a nuclear power plant? Or let me put it another way. Would you trust a nuclear power plant that was built based upon re-engineering off hacked plans from Southern Company by another person around the world? And what is the consequence to us if that's going to happen? In 2015 and 16, largely due to Russian aggression, there were repeated attacks against the Ukrainian grid. And in 2016, I think we got an acknowledgement from those that protect us here in this country that there were 290 cyber attacks on critical infrastructure control systems in that year. We had an intrusion in 2017 at a Kansas nuclear facility that was tied to Russia. And just in September and in October of last year, we've had a tremendous uptick in warnings from the government, DHS and FBI, in a circular that came out in October. And a month before that, Symantec, the cybersecurity contractor, gave guidance to the energy sector. I commend those to you. I have copies if you want to see them, but if you pull them up, I think they would be really helpful. You know, when I was U.S. Attorney, we had this term APT, Advanced Persistent Threat, that I thought was part of my top secret side of my life, and I was never allowed to talk about APTs. And if you were a company in my jurisdiction, I might take you for a private briefing so you could understand the specific threat to your industry and your company. And we'd read you in and make you top secret for a day, and then we would read you out. And I never thought I was allowed to say the words APT. Well, the APT has now been described all over the place, and I think if you simply want to do something useful when I'm done, after you leave here today, go online and read about advanced persistent threat descriptions within your industry. It would be very helpful to you. The types of attacks that we are dealing with to review in your sector deal with functionality, operational technology, the SCADA systems, theft of your intellectual property, attacks on our critical infrastructure, or physical damage to your plants. The consequences, as described by a congressional commission, and this sounds like worst case, and it sounds like, end of the world stuff, that if we had a large-scale blackout in this country, 90% of our population could perish from disease, lack of food, and societal breakdown. One data point is, and it came up in the most recent cry and WannaCry attacks by North Korea, particularly in Europe. And if you don't know, we had some spillover of that here at the Allegheny Health System in Sewickley, where the hospital was shut down. But the speculation is that in 3 days of no access to your Mac machine, no ability to buy food at the grocery store, society will turn against each other. And if you're unable to get critical health care, then there becomes a panic. So the ripple effect of one of the attacks here demonstrates clearly that public safety, health, and economic security are at risk. Now, our regulatory framework, as you know better than me, is through FERC. There are critical infrastructure protection standards that have been developed in North America through FERC and NERC, and also the important role that's played everywhere by the state public utility commissions. I think that investor-owned utilities which operate under the state public utility commissions, which are outside FERC jurisdiction, probably should be in. That's my opinion. The good news here is that in Pennsylvania we have a good framework, and we have requirements under the Pennsylvania Code that exceed the standards in other states across the country. But I know the last panel ended with questions of a wish list of what we could do, but I would urge you to be active in this space, not only for yourself, but for all of us in our country, because of the unique and critical role that you play, that we need a unified framework. And I recognize I say this at a time when it has become politically popular to be against government regulation. But I would urge you to consider that if you put out the white noise of the political debate, which is always positive. I just came back from a trip to Asia, and I recognize once again that generally I don't worry about whether I'm going to die when I eat my food in the United States. I don't worry about whether this building is going to fall down on us when we meet in the United States. I don't worry about whether I'm going to get sick from drinking the water when I'm in the United States. So those of you who understand and deal every day with the cost of government regulation, I get it, that becomes a challenge for your work. But I sat at a program 20 years ago that was run by Exxon and Southern Company and its predecessors when I was at a retreat at Norfolk Southern down in South Carolina, and listened to much of the same discussion about how we were going to develop greater percentages share of our industrial capacity and our supply from a wider range of non-greenhouse gas producing products. Now recognize I was a railroad lawyer and they had an interest in shipping coal. And it was really something for them to put these customers in the room and talk about something that was going to directly affect their bottom line. I'm not here to argue the greenhouse gas debate, but on the subject of protecting against the cyber threat, I would urge all of you that you have as great an interest as anybody, and certainly a desire to protect your fellow citizens like I did and I do, that we do not allow ourselves to be in a position to deal with a threat that if you just look at popular cinema, This is kind of one of my, permit me to get up on my high horse. You remember the movie War Games with Matthew Broderick? 1983, friends. You remember the movie Matrix? 1999. Do you remember the last totally ridiculously horrible Bruce Willis movie, of which they were all? 2007 was a cyber attack against the US government in Washington, D.C. That's 11 years ago. We're talking about a problem that's 35 years old in cinema. So it ought to be that we have a shared interest in not getting into the circular firing squad discussion of here comes the government again. I would urge you as private industry to take the lead and make sure that we can have sensible regulation that protects you, and that we don't allow these gaps in the requirements in such a way that we can honestly say that we are in imminent danger because we haven't created the right set of authorities so that we know how to protect ourselves in the event of a disaster that could potentially kill 90% of our population. So in conclusion, I want to say a couple things. First, what do we need to do? We need to understand that an attack is not a matter of if, but when. You will be attacked. Second, you need to use the cybersecurity framework, which tells you to do in simple terms 3 things. Identify risks, protect against them, and respond and recover, or in other words, be resilient. Third, you need to embed cybersecurity into your company culture and make it part of your strategic planning at every level, from the bottom up and from the top down. Fourth, your greatest risk is probably your supply chain. Your third-party risk can be managed by requiring of your suppliers that they have good practices, and if they are so indispensable to you, you better understand that you own their flaws. Fifth, make security requirements for future energy systems a key part of business planning. A couple of additional recommendations would be help us concentrate on workforce development. The government statistics are that in the next year we need 1.5 million new cybersecurity professionals, and we have about 500,000 in the pipeline, 1 million short, and that delta is going to grow every year. You in the private sector will have the ability to hire them over the public sector, and maybe the public sector will become your training ground because you pay more. And they have a lot to offer to you because once they get public sector work, they have an insight that may be helpful to you. But we all have a shared need here, and we aim here in Western Pennsylvania, and particularly through our Cyber Institute, to try and make this the place that you would come to for youth training and workforce development. In conclusion, I want to share this with you. There is a huge disconnect between the severity and complexity of the risk that you face and we face as a nation, and the simplicity of the attacks, which are crude attacks, whether they're DDoS attacks, spear phishing, spyware, Trojan horses. These are things that we know what they are and we can identify. They are almost not that sophisticated. And there's also a very simple solution that I described, 3 things you could do for cyber hygiene. And often when I'm speaking to the uninitiated, which is not you, people come up to me and say, how can it be that this is this significant, but you can fix it by changing your password? It must not be this significant. You who are experienced in this field need to help us help others understand that this gap between the severity of the threat and the simplicity of what we can do to fix it is not something that should allow us to ignore it, because that, in my judgment, is the greatest hidden risk in the cybersecurity threat in the energy sector and elsewhere. I appreciate your attention. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take any questions if you have any. There's a question over here, Kevin.
You mentioned losing sleep tonight. So when you think about the transition from the electrical grid we have now to a smart grid, which has more site access points, do you lose sleep or do you sleep better?
Very good question. And you can superimpose that question on our discussion about the election system, right? You know, some people are saying we can't protect ourselves in elections, so we should go back to paper ballots and we can have Aunt Bee cook some pies, and while we're counting the ballots, we can have Aunt Bee's warm pies. I mean, did you see the conversation the other night in the special election between Wolf Blitzer and the guy in Washington County? Did that make you laugh? I mean, honest to God. And so I don't think we can go backwards. I think that the connectivity that we are going to get is just too useful to us, and we will never go backwards. And I'm not a believer that we have a choice between encryption and access for purposes of law enforcement. I believe we can do smart encryption and limited encryption. I used encryption as U.S. Attorney. So when we had the problem with the San Bernardino terrorists and we couldn't get at their phone, when we didn't know whether there were more terrorists out there, and Apple was fighting with the FBI over encryption, and that silliness of FBI trying to get Apple by a court process to open a phone and Apple resisting. So FBI got a consultant to open the phone, and then Apple sued FBI and said, wait a second, how did you open that phone? You know, that's not where we need to be. We need intelligent people of goodwill to say, look, there are things we need to encrypt, but for proper government access, such as reporting, review, accident incident, or law enforcement matters, we need to be able to get in. We can solve that. But I think smart grids can be designed in such a way that we can enhance security, not reduce security. Other questions? Yes?
I thought you had many interesting points throughout the presentation, but the thing that resonated with me the most, and keeping in mind that there's quite a lot of people in the utility sector here, is identifying your threats. In a time whenever we know that cyber threats are increasingly coming from a variety of different sources, if you're speaking to utility members here in Pennsylvania, do you have a presumption as to who's the most likely threat against the utility sector? Is it state
Insider.
actor? There you go.
Insider. So one of the things I teased you with, but I didn't complete the thought for my prepared remarks, is the concept of tailoring your program to your own system. I don't know where you operate. I know Southern Company about 6 ways, and I'm a big fan of Southern Company. But they obviously have a larger footprint than some of you other in the room. I don't know within the territory you operate whether you have a risk of nation-state actors who might include on-the-ground spies or cyber digital spies who are trying to learn about your systems. I mean, one of the last cases that was announced most recently out of my former office, which was an investigation that I started, involved Chinese theft of global positioning satellite technology. Now that's something we can probably all agree that's important. There was a very celebrated cyber case where they found people digging in the dirt in Iowa in the pioneer seed fields where we were doing research with regard to seeds that could develop more harvest. There's something we probably could agree is strategic and important. I don't know whether you have strategic assets that are flashing lights for our adversaries. You know that. I don't know whether your geographic territory hits where you're going to be at risk. You know that. There's a threat assessment that you need to do. There's some really good work done by CMU that's been trumpeted all over the world about insiders and identifying insiders, but generally, you know, a person who has a marital problem, a person who has a gambling problem, I'm starting to sound like I'm describing everyone who works at the White House, but a person shouldn't have a security clearance. I mean, there are these metrics that everybody agrees with. So, you know, if you have an employee who starts acting oddly, you have an employee who starts taking a computer home, you have an employee who's starting to look at files in a proprietary possessive way, these things are indicators and markers, and you need to invest in this. This is an investment that you need to make because it's for you, but it's for all of us. And under the Regulatory Reform Act that I believe will come, whether you participate or not, the issue of threat detection, incident reporting, which can in fact affect you for purposes of securities regulation reporting, is also going to become a matter for FERC governance and state governance. And, you know, just so you know, the whole issue of cybersecurity reporting is very complicated for multinational companies because of the different standards around the world. But I spent a lot of time over at the NCFTA, which is a great asset you should make yourself aware of here. It's being franchised off Pittsburgh to New York and LA. What happens, how often does that happen? And it was one of the keys to my success as U.S. Attorney. But they are sort of Switzerland for co-locating law enforcement and companies to identify threats, establish patches. But when you work with them, and I go over sometimes as a mascot when I meet, when countries come with their law enforcement people, they want to meet me. And I'm struck by how severe the sanctions are in some countries around the world for failing to report cyber incidents. In some countries, it's a crime. You know, you want to talk about government regulation coming upon you, that's an issue, but we're well past the period of time where you proprietarily own your own cyber incidents, because they affect all of us now. And I think you should embrace that and run with it. Last question? Any more? Thank you very much. It's been an honor and a pleasure.